The number one issue people have with modelers is that it doesn't feel like a real amp. Yes, it sounds really good and it sounds exactly like a tube amplifier mic'd up. But what people are saying is it doesn't feel and it doesn't respond the way real amplifiers do. So in this video, I'm going to go over a few different ways to make your amp modelers, whether it's the Line 6 HX Stomp, a Fractal AXFX 2, one of the new Kemper profile players. I'm going to go over a few different ways to make your amp modelers feel and respond more like a real tube amp. Let's get into it. So spend any time on any forum that has to do with amp modelers, and you'll likely run into the idea of FRFR, which stands for full range flat response. This idea is that it's a speaker, usually a powered speaker, kind of like a PA system, and it has the full range of sonic spectrum, meaning from like 20 hertz all the way up to, let's say, 50,000 hertz. And it has a flat response, meaning that the sound that it pumps out through the speakers has an EQ curve of flat. Now, a true FRFR I don't think actually exists. There comes some that come really close. Like, there's a couple humps and a little dips here and there. But no speaker system is completely flat, at least not yet. But the notion is that the flatter that response curve is, the more and more that the sound that you hear through your speakers directly from the unit is going to translate into the real world. Now, this sounds all great and well because, that's what you're hearing when you listen to microphones and singers through the PA, right? You're hearing a full range flat response theoretically, right? And I'm saying theoretically because, it is micros, right? It's essentially flat if you really look at it. But that's not necessarily the best solution for amp modelers. And here's why. Most guitar amplifiers and the speakers, if you look at the graphs from the charts that come with the manuals and stuff like that, or even if you just do a simple Google search, what is the frequency range of guitar amplifiers, and you'll get something along the lines of between 80 hertz and about 6,500 hertz. So if you have an FRFR speaker range that goes from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, you have a lot of area that is not being used for traditional guitar sounds. And in those areas, it's going to add to different sounds. And if you're listening to the guitar amp modeler in the room with an FRFR blasting, you're hearing between 6,500 hertz and 20 hertz, and you're feeling that, and you're like, that doesn't feel like a real amp, because real amps don't put out those frequencies. And yes, the responses are going to be differently because it is not responding the same way that a frequency of a guitar amp and a guitar cabinet will sound like. So the best way to combat this is to go to your global settings. Regardless of whatever amp modeler you have, they're going to have global settings. And I like to set my global EQ. And I set my global EQ to about 65 hertz on the low end to get over that 60 cycle hum, but also have enough headroom if I want to do like drop D or drop C sharp or whatever. And then I usually go up to about 6,500, 7K hertz. And that's going to represent a higher and more responsive frequency that you'd get out of a guitar cabinet that's actually in your room. So that's the first way to make the amps and the amp modelers feel more and more like a real tube amp. The next thing you want to look at is miking the cabinets within your amp modeler. Now, some of the older Fractal units like the XL, the 2XL Plus doesn't have as nearly of sophistication when it comes to mic placements and mic options as something like the Line 6 HX Stomp does these days. But if you can mess around with the different cabinets and different microphones, you might find that those amp modelers are sounding a lot better within the room. I have found, especially at lower volumes, that if I'm using something like a 4x12 cabinet with a Marshall, it sounds a lot darker, muddier than if I swap that out with a 2x12. It sounds a little bit brighter, especially at lower volumes, because that's what amp modelers are meant for, right? They're meant for lower volumes. And there is a difference between recorded tone and then live tone, right, with the amp modelers. I think it becomes a little bit more apparent when you're trying to use a recorded tone at home and then you try to use it in a live mix and things happen at higher volumes. So keep that in mind. What I like to do, especially with the Line 6 HX Stomp, is sometimes I like to double cabinet, use two different cabinets for one amplifier. that gives us some different sounds, and it fills in certain sonic palettes that seems to fill the room a little bit better in a real case scenario. And then I also like to use multiple microphones, move around those placements, put it a little bit closer, a little bit further away. The ideal spot is right off the dust cap, but sometimes you got to mess around a little bit and see what really works for your best use case scenario. Another great way to get your amp modelers feeling and sounding like a real amplifier in the room is to download other people's presets or their other people's impulse responses, or IRs. Now, the factory presets are incredible on a lot of these units. That line 6, I mean, it is heads and shoulders some of the best presets I've ever heard in my life. But there's always room for improvement. There are tons of people who have captured their own IRs and sell them as packs, or maybe give them for free. I don't know. Leave a comment down below what's your favorite IRs and impulse responses and presets for whatever amp model you're using to spread the love to everybody else. Because if you're not satisfied with how your amp is feeling and sounding in the room, maybe switching out some impulse responses and loading up some professional ones might help get the sound that you have in your head out into the real world. The surest way to make your amp feel and sound like a real amplifier in the room is to run it through an amplifier. And I know I'm blowing some minds here, not really because it's obvious, but there are plenty of clean headroom amplifiers like the solid state matrix, for example, which is pretty expensive, comes like $1,000. And then you have something like this. This is the Seymour Duncan Power Stage 200. It is a beast of a machine, 200 watts of power, of pure clean power that you can plug in your amp modeler, and then plug this in to a cabinet like this Blackstar St. James 2x12, and then all of a sudden your amp tones are sounding just like your amp tones because it's clean. You want to turn off the cab block, but it's clean, so it's just cranking the amp sounds that you already have in your modeler, running it through this bad boy, cranking it up to speaker volumes, and then it's coming out of the Blackstar, and it sounds and feels just like a real amplifier because, quite frankly, it is a real amplifier at this point, but you're using the tones of your amp modeler. And the cool thing here is it also has a XLR out, and you can turn on a cab sim. So you can send this directly to the PA, and it will have the simulation of a cab and have the stage volume that feels like a cab. So you're literally playing a real life guitar amp at that point with the sounds of, like, a matchless, if you're running a matchless, or a Dumble for that instance. So one of the best ways, and quite frankly I think the best way to make your guitar amp modeler sound like a real amp and feel like a real amp is to run it through a clean power amp like the Seymour Duncan Power Stage 200. The next tip, which I think everybody should be doing to make their amp modelers feel like real amps, is to put a drive or a distortion or even a boost pedal before their amp modeler. It will significantly change the feel of the amp modeler and make it feel more like a real amp. This is the Keeley Tone Workstation. I think it's one of the best pedals in the world. It has a boost, it has a compressor, it has a Marshall, kind of like Marshall in a box kind of thing, if you want to use that. And it has 2 different Tube Screamer variants. I use this before all of my amp modelers, or at least something similar to this. It really helps boost that input signal into the amp modelers and really helps drive the signal. And I think it makes it feel a lot more like a real amplifier. And personally, I think this is the best pedal that you can get, especially if you're playing country music. And if you want to learn more about this guitar pedal, check this video over there, and I'll see you in the next video. And until then, let the music play.